In our last class, we spent most of our time focusing on 4 points of performance that I consider to make an effective proof. One of them is that the strategy that the proof author is using is clear from the writing. That as a reader, we can tell what is the overall approach to this proof. Is it a direct proof? Is it an indirect proof? Is it an induction? Are there cases? And so on and so forth. The second point was to make sure that, oh gosh, what was number 2? I'm remembering 3 and 4 now. What was number 2? The second point is that the burden of proof should always be known by me as a reader. At any point in reading your proof, I should know, all right, what is the tripwire here? What is the thing that they're building towards, which if they deduce it, means that the proof is over. State your burden of proof, especially when that burden of proof changes throughout the course of your proof. So in this example that we started working on, the original burden of proof is we wanted to show G is abelian. But then once we process that burden of proof through the definition of what it means for a group to be abelian, it changed the burden of proof, because once an A and B were chosen arbitrarily, now our new burden of proof is to prove that A times B is equal to B times A. Right? So that was point number 2. Point number 3, no surprises, no surprise symbols in particular, that if a variable or a symbol shows up in your proof, it should first be told to the reader where that entity is coming from, and if there was a quantifier that was eliminated, how was that quantifier eliminated? These are our let statements. Let A and B be chosen arbitrarily. And they're chosen arbitrarily because why? How come we don't get to choose specific A's and B's in this particular proof? What does this word connect to? Yeah, Kenzie.
Because it has to be for all.
Right, because the thing we're trying to prove, our burden of proof, is a universal for all statement, right? So we don't get to choose the A and the B. The universe chooses at its random whim, and then we have to deal with whatever the universe chose. And we also specified here that A and B had to be chosen from the set of elements of the group G, right? So those let statements make sure that there's no surprises. Once we write down something like, now we wish to prove AB is equal to BA, we can look above that and see, oh, this is what A and B meant. Right? So they were defined, they were brought into existence by you, the author of the proof, before they're then used as part of your proof. And then finally, we haven't had the opportunity to do this here yet, but attribution. Make sure that you're giving reasons for any logical deduction that you make using what I call bylines, things like by construction, by definition, by theorem, by assumption, that kind of thing, so that give the reader a reason to believe that your conclusion follows from your premises. So let's jump back into this proof. In this proof, we're assuming that G is some group that satisfies what we call mixed cancellation. This is that thing that's not quite left cancellation, it's not quite right cancellation. It says that if I have an x on the left side of one expression and the right side of the other expression in my equation, then a mixed cancellation group has the property that we can cancel those x's and get y equals z. But the content of this proposition is that not every group satisfies mixed cancellation, but in fact, every group which does satisfy mixed cancellation is an abelian group. In other words, all the operation is commutative. Okay? That there's no way to have a group that's not completely commutative that satisfies mixed cancellation. Another way to think about that. All right, so our burden of proof is that now that the universe has chosen an A and a B, we need to prove that AB is equal to BA. If we wanted to, we could even add a byline right here. Let me add that in just to be really over the top here. So what is the reason? Like, why do we want to prove AB equals BA? What are we making an appeal to here? Yeah?
By definition of abelian?
Yes, exactly. We're making an appeal to the definition of abelian group. By definition of abelian, we wish to prove AB is equal to BA. Right. Okay, so now we actually have to do that, and our burden of proof is that equation, AB equals BA. We need to show that this thing is true. So how are we going to show that that thing is true? I'm going to put my focus on this. So since this is my burden of proof, this is the thing I want to work with. I don't want to go back to this equation, xy equals zx implies y equals z. I don't want to go back to that property. What I want to do is I want to use that property to tell me something about this equation, AB equals BA. So let's see if over here on our napkin side, so now I'm sort of saying my napkin has this equation on it, AB equals BA. and maybe a question mark over here off to the side. So how am I going to establish this? Well, okay. Suppose mixed cancellation is a thing. Let's think about how we might arrive at this equation from a mixed cancellation. Because if mixed cancellation is a thing, it also means that mixed multiplication should be a thing. Right? So if I had some element, let me call it x, and I had it on the left side of one of these expressions and the right side of the other, then my mixed cancellation would let me just cross out those x's and conclude that AB equals BA. So is there a way to choose this x wisely so that we can actually believe this equation is true and then use mixed cancellation to deduce that this equation is true, which is my burden of proof? Right? Can you see a wise choice of x that could actually give me an equation here that I could believe? Yeah, Ashley.
E.
E? All right, so let's try x equals e. Okay, I believe this, right? That EAB equals BAE will then imply AB is equal to BA. And remember, this line here is my burden of proof. So I need to convince the reader why this is true. But that requires me to first convince them why this is true. Well, why is this equation true? EAB equals BAE. I don't think we know that it is. Right? But if it's true, then I agree we can cancel the e's by mixed cancellation. So we're going to have to get a little bit more cunning with our choice of what we put there on both sides. Casey, idea?
Could you do the inverse of A?
The inverse of A. So if I choose x to be A inverse, what happens? The a's are going to cancel on which side of the equation?
Both the left and the right.
Aha. And what can I say about this equation, B equals B? This feels like a true statement, just by the reflexive property of equality, right? Okay, so that's work that I just did over on a napkin, right? One of the places where novice authors of proofs often get sort of derided for their proofs is that sometimes this is what makes it onto your page, is this sort of written in this order without the sort of superstructure and logic and narrative built around it, which means that you did the hard work of making the discovery, but now we need to do the work of framing it in a communication context. And really, that almost always involves going backwards, because we want to arrive at my burden of proof. We don't want to start at our burden of proof, because we and the readers should not believe the burden of proof to be true until it's been demonstrated. So we're going to do this backwards. We're going to start from this thing which we know is true, and then we're going to work towards the thing which we're trying to establish. It's like trying to cross a river. We want to put the stepping stones in front of our feet, closer to our shore, as opposed to throwing the stepping stones to the other shore and then trying to jump across. So we'll start with what we know is true. B is equal to B. So we might say, since B is equal to B, why is that true? This is a minor point, so I'm going to give this one away by reflexive property of equality. Reflexive property of equality. Now, if I go from this line to this line, where is my A inverse A coming from? What do I get when I do A inverse times A? We get identity. So actually, I think I want an intermediate step in between here. So we had B equals B down here at the bottom. But what I probably want on the next line is I want to introduce my A inverse by first calling that E and putting it on the left side of one of the B's and on the right side of the other B. How do I know I can do that?
Anything times the identity of the self.
Regardless of whether it happens on the left side or the right side. Exactly. The identity property that we have in every group is a two-sided identity. And so E times B and B times E are not only the same as one another, they're the same as B. So EB equals BE. And I'm going to try to avoid using symbols on my proof over here on the right side when I actually communicate. I'll try to use words as much as I can. We have EB equals BE by the identity property. I'll abbreviate that, though. Identity property that exists in every group. Uh-oh. Take me back. Where did I go? Here we go. By the identity property. Okay. And then where did I go from there? Right. We rewrote each of these E's as the product of an A inverse and an A, but we did it in a different way on the left side as we did on the right side. Right. Here we rewrote E as A inverse times A. So we'll introduce that one. A inverse A. And why is it true that A inverse A is equal to identity? That's the inverse property. And the inverse property, just like the identity property, was also a two-sided property. A times A inverse and A inverse times A are both equal to the identity. Right? Identities work on both sides. And so by the inverse property, we have this. By the inverse property. Ugh, I'm running out of space on the screen. But now that we've established this, how do we get from this line to that line? What's the byline attribution for this last step? What am I doing on this last step? Left and right cancellation, which we gave a special name to that property. Mixed cancellation, right. Because left and right cancellation, remember, individually exist in every group. But mixed cancellation, for us at least, only exists in this group that we're making the assumption about here in this problem. Right? And so you might say, by mixed cancellation of the A inverse, and we knew, why did we know mixed cancellation applied? That was an assumption, exactly. But when I do that mixed cancellation, I get AB equals BA. But I'm going to add that one more byline, right? By assumption of mixed cancellation. In G. AB is equal to BA. And then because now we can see as the reader, that was exactly the burden of proof that we wish to establish. Now that we've established it, the proof is over. Put a box, put a QED, whatever you like for your end of proof signifier. So again, one of the main points of talking about proof so much is to underline the difference between the creative process of discovery that happens on your napkin on the one side, right, which is almost entirely symbolic and which probably has meaning only to you, and maybe not even you if you look at it the next day, right? Versus the narrative, the written communication form of a proof that needs to communicate to somebody who didn't have your epiphany, didn't have your insight, sitting, writing on a cocktail napkin, but you want them to understand what is the structure of the proof. And so, really, proof writing is about the process of first making the discovery and then making the translation. Keeping those 4 points of performance in mind. So we, first of all, signaled that we were using a direct proof strategy by first assuming the hypothesis of the if-then, and then stating that we wish to deduce the conclusion. So this is a direct proof, and the burden of proof is G is abelian. But then by plugging in the definition of abelian, we turned that burden of proof into one that was more concrete by introducing an A and a B chosen arbitrarily by the random chaos of the universe, and then endeavoring to prove that AB is equal to BA. That's my new burden of proof. Then I took this over to my napkin and said, how am I going to do this? And so we played around with it a little bit. We sort of did a mixed cancellation backwards because we knew that's where we kind of wanted to come from. And then figured out, all right, if we can regress all the way back to here, we know the steps that can get us back home. And then we just communicated those steps, giving a byline for each one of the steps, leading us from point A to point B. And then once we've established that this thing which we said was the burden of proof is true, that means our proof is over.